one of my, it's a subject that I'm particularly interested in. Cayce readings all of them are very interesting to me, and of course, with my research, the ones on Atlantis and ancient flight and the terrible crystal are particularly interesting to me. One of my popular books is a book on technology of the gods. And I did another book on Vimanas, and then I did a book called Atlantis and the Power System of the Gods. So you're going to see some kind of unusual things, and I'll bet you'll have a few questions when we're all over. So, and you can ask me any questions, too, about my earlier presentation, too. So with that, we'll get going. And so in my book, Technology of the Gods, I go into what it takes to have high technology, and to put it really quickly, the whole idea of having a sophisticated society with high technology, like we have today. You know, in fact, the early chapter of that book, I actually talk about sanitation. And, you know, having good plumbing and sewage systems and a good water system, and, you know, that kind of thing. And today we take that all for granted, although, you know, it hasn't been that long, only just a little bit over 100 years that we've had, you know, modern toilets we have with very simple, you know, water lock. That the modern toilet, by the way, was invented in England by Mr. Crapper, all right? So. But I'm not going to go into all that. We'll just, yeah, that's one of the first things you need for high technology is good sanitation and nice toilets and plumbing. But the other things that you need for high technology, you need metals, you need electricity, you need machines. And of course, we have all that today. So the big question is, did they have that in ancient times? And I'm going to try and convince you tonight that they did. Electricity. You got to have electricity to have high technology. And did the ancients have electricity? Yeah, they did. We have the Baghdad battery. And it was a very kind of a simple DC current with copper tubes, and even using some acidic thing like wine and vinegar, and then they connected them into a series. And they think that the Baghdad battery was used for electroplating and electroplating objects. And in fact, it's kind of interesting that one of the uses probably of the Baghdad battery was making fake gold objects by, you know, electroplating them with gold and then selling them as like gold statues and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, the ancients did have batteries. We know that. The ancients did have complicated machines. This is the Antikythera device. The Antikythera device was found on Easter in 1902 on a shipwreck, sponge divers in that very small island of Antikythera. We're diving on a shipwreck, and they brought up what appeared to be this box. And it was encrusted. It has a date on it from like 300 BC or something, saying it was built in the island of Rhodes. The Antikythera device was like a computer with all these cog wheels and things like that. It had hundreds of interlocking, wheels and things like that. It was far more complicated than some Swiss clock or something like that. And in fact, when in the 50s, Scientific American, an American scientist started looking at the Antikythera device. Today it's in the Athens Museum. And they were astonished at how sophisticated a machine it was. They couldn't believe that in ancient times, we're talking several thousands of years ago, I mean, they were making machines and devices like this. It was a computer. It was an astronomical device. You could dial up like constellations and stars. You would use it for navigation and things like that. And there must have been a number of these things. And in the in the 50s, they actually said, you know, finding the Antikythera device was like finding a jet plane in the tomb of King Tut. That's what they said. And little did they know that they were going to find a jet plane in the tomb of King Tut. We'll get into that. So yeah, if you go to the Temple of Dendera in Egypt, if you go down into a crypt, there's other parts, and in fact this depiction is in a number of places within the Dendera temple. Although these rock reliefs are down inside a crypt, you've got to go down inside. Today, the Egyptian tour guides and stuff, they're happy to take you down there and show you. Only a few can get down in there. And this is what it looks like. It does appear to be some kind of electrical device. These guys are standing here. They've got these tubes. It's like this snake, kind of a filament. There's cables coming out of the back of these things. They're running down here. They go into this box over here. You've got these kind of sacred baboons standing here with these knives and stuff. You've got these little miniature guys here doing whatever, you know. I mean, it's all kind of strange. And it appears to be some electrical device, for sure. It certainly appears that way to me. Now, Egyptologists and archaeologists, this is totally real. I mean, they have to have an explanation for this. And it can't be an electrical device because, well, according to them, they didn't have electrical devices. Their explanation is that this is a lotus flower, and this and the kind of bulb and everything is the aroma of a flower.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yeah. Would I kid you? No. So that is the explanation. Okay, Egyptologists. I mean, that is their explanation. This is not an electrical device. This is a flower, and that is the sweet-smelling flower. You know, that's their explanation. I would say it was an electrical device, and I'm not going to belabor this point because I really want to get to a lot of other stuff. But yeah, one of the mysteries too with a lot of the tombs and stuff in Egypt, like the Valley of the Kings and stuff, is that many of these tombs are cut into solid rock. By the way, no Egyptian mummy was ever found in a pyramid in Egypt. But we found lots of mummies. They're found in these crypts deep underground, cut through solid rock. They make twists and turns and all that kind of stuff. And then the Egyptian Book of the Dead is painted on the ceilings and stuff like that. And one of the things that kind of baffled Egyptians for a while was that there was no real evidence of people in these tombs to paint these paintings. But what kind of light did they use? And I assume they went in there with torches and stuff like that, but there was not soot on the ceilings and things. So one of the explanations that they came up with was that they were using a very convoluted series of mirrors to bring sunlight down from the entrance, bouncing it around corners, getting it up. And even today, Egyptian guides and stuff will do kind of many things like that where they use sort of mirrors to light that. But many of these things, like the Valley of Kings and stuff, I mean, they're deep, deep underground, all these twists and turns. I mean, to light these passages and stuff with like mirrors would be really difficult. So, I mean, one possibility is that ancient Egyptian temples and tombs and things like that were actually being lit by electric lights. And it wouldn't be, like, say, even in dynastic times in Egypt. I mean, they may not have, like everybody in their little huts may not have electric lights, but the temples did. And that was part of the whole thing with many of the temples in the Middle East and other areas, and even part of the crystal skulls and stuff, where you'd walk into these temples and you would see amazing stuff. I mean, they were lit by electric lights that you had never seen. That was like magic. One of the things with the Mitchell Hedges crystal skull, which had a movable jawbone and stuff like that, was that they would manipulate it, make it talk on an altar, and you'd go into, like I say, in theory, I mean, this is all just conjecture, but you'd go into like a Mayan temple or something, say, where there would be a crystal skull on an altar. And that, not only, is it kind of lit and it's all kind of weird, but then this skull would start talking to you. And, its jaw would move, and some priest, was like under the floor, and he's manipulating it, and this skull's talking to you, and, I mean, you're blown away, and the skull tells you, just tip the priests really big on your way out, So the idea too, okay, so the idea, I mean, we think they had electricity. We know they had metals. We know they had machines. all this can, lead to now to, let's say, bigger things, which include heavy machinery, and then, airplanes and airships and flying machines, kind of thing. Now, this is interesting too. This is a pendant. It's gold. It was found in Panama. It's an ancient pendant. It's about 5 inches long. It's basically jewelry in a sense. It's made out of gold. Haven't been able to date it. You can't really date some gold artifact like this just by itself. It's got a stone here. They're not sure what kind of a stone it is. Today it's in a museum in Panama. And if you look at it, it appears to be Ivan T. Sanderson, who's also one of my heroes and wrote a bunch of books. He was very much interested in anomalies and things like that. He got interested in this little thing. It's got what appears to be a skid plate in the front. It's like a monster. This is what's known as a zoomorphic pendant or something, and that it's like a machine, but it's made also into an animal. All right, here's a drawing of what it looks like and what it appears to be. And what Ivan T. Sanderson thought with it was that this was like a backhoe, and was a jewelry of a backhoe. All right, and here's the blade and everything back here. It's got these like blades. It's got another blade here. It's really kind of this monster. Okay, right. And yeah, so in a sense, what this thing would be like this. Like we call it a backhoe. I mean, it's heavy machinery used for digging. And in fact, that's one of the things that really transforms our world today is, caterpillar bulldozers, graders, earth-moving machines that just shape the world around us, and that's what's created us now. And apparently, incredibly, yeah, they had these in ancient times too. And this would be like, again, what a zoomorphic depiction of something is. It's really a big digging machine, but it's also a monster. Yeah. So yeah, did they have heavy machinery? Well, apparently they may well have. This is one of the gold, so-called airplanes in the Gold Museum in Bogota, Colombia. And it too is a piece of jewelry. And in fact, there's a number of these. They've found like dozens of it. It looks a lot like a Delta jet with wings and stuff like that. It's got, and in fact, Ivan T. Sanderson looked into this too. The way they decided with this thing was that, yeah, it was a kind of all things, an aero submarine. And there's a kind of the Air Force and stuff was creating this, but a plane that flies and then can dive into the water. And there's certain configurations that those things have to be to come out of the water if you're underwater, and then, like a seaplane or something, to actually lift off, from, say, the surface. And this thing, they even thought went underwater. So, yeah, the idea of these things, they would even, at the Gold Museum in Colombia, they'd put them in formation and stuff like that, And they're just fine. They're gold. Gold, by the way, gold is indestructible. And these things are made of gold. You can't date gold when these were made. All gold from ancient times still exists today. Gold is indestructible. You can't destroy it, and it won't rust. All the gold jewelry and coins of ancient times is still around today, and jewelry and bullion and stuff like that. But gold is too soft. It doesn't work well for machinery. You need to make machinery out of harder metals, and those metals will rust. They will oxidize, and that's also part of the problem with your Atlantean Mercedes in the desert. That it really needs to be sealed in a hall of records or something like that. Otherwise, it will oxidize and rust away, and it just won't be there. So this was a glider, and this is your jet airplane in the tomb of King Tut right here. And this was found in a tomb in Saqqara, They thought it was they said it was, make a little glider model airplane kind of thing. Now back at Abydos, up on a lintel, you might have seen this before. This is totally real. There are these things. And these things are way up high. They're like 40 feet on a lintel, giant lintel in the temple at Abydos. This oddball thing here, looking like a helicopter. This one over here too, kind of looking like almost like a cigar-shaped airship or submarine or something. And this one right here, also looking like some kind of a jet plane and stuff. This one down here also kind of looks sort of like a plane or something. But a lot of these things, like this one, the helicopter, and this one down here, the explanation that, and again, mainstream Egyptologists have to have explanations for this stuff. And they have a kind of a good explanation for like these, like the helicopter one that looks like a helicopter, and that is that these are two hieroglyphs superimposed on each other, and that one hieroglyph had been there, and then years later they came along and they patched up and they chiseled another hieroglyph on it, and that is actually a pretty good explanation, particularly for the helicopter one, because this is actually like an arm here. It does look like a helicopter though. But when I was there and talking to Egyptologists, this glyph here, that looks like the jet plane and stuff, they don't have an explanation for that. And as Egyptologists and stuff told me that they don't know what combination of hieroglyphs this could be or what hieroglyph it is. So, yeah, the idea that, there's some kind of a jet plane or something like that carved there. Here's a close-up of it. Yeah, there's something going on here, and this is genuinely a mystery. The idea of ancient flight is pretty common around the world. The Chinese have they have stories of ancient flying people. You have the stories too, like the Arabian Nights and stuff like that, of flying carpets and whatnot. So it's a fairly common thing, and just in legends and myths around the world. The Kebra Nagast, which is an Ethiopian text, talks about King Solomon having a flying machine and flying to Ethiopia to visit Queen of Sheba. She likes to listen to the radio when she's listening to him. And this is actually a cartoon that from a British magazine in the 40s. But when the Kebra Nagast was first translated from Ethiopian script by Sir Wallace Budge in the 30s, and he also did the Egyptian Book of the Dead and stuff, part of the book is about King Solomon having this flying machine flying around. And so, the British journalists thought that was all very amusing, and so they created this little cartoon. And but the thing is that in ancient times there are many depictions on Assyrian cylinder seals and things like that of people, they're in their flying disc. And here are these guys. It's a disc, but it's winged, and they're flying somewhere, going places. When you go to India and Southeast Asia, every Hindu, every Buddhist has heard of Vimanas. And when you read the ancient Hindu epics of the Mahabharata and Ramayana, which is part of it, the Dronaparva, many other books, they are full of stories of flight. And when they're in Sanskrit, they're called Vimanas. And the famous story of Rama, this is actually, you have your air chariots. This is in the Bangkok airport, actually. And this is Rama here. He's in his flying chariot. The story of the Ramayana is we'll get into it just in a second. The ancient Indian epics, like the Ramayana and Mahabharata stuff, they read like the wildest science fiction. They're like some Buck Rogers novel story that people are buzzing around in these airships. They're blasting each other. It's devastating wars. They have these horrific weapons. They decimate entire cities. It's bad. And they're using aerial weapons, and these aerial machines are part of the story. Well, archaeologists thought it was, totally fanciful. This couldn't be true. But then, right after World War II, British and Indian and Pakistani archaeologists began excavating these cities in the Sindh Desert, which is all along the border of India and Pakistan. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. And they started finding some really unusual things. These cities had been destroyed. There was areas that had been melted. These are called the Harappan civilization. This is a seal. They're still trying to decipher this script. They haven't yet. This is all pre-Sanskrit. Mainstream archaeologists say this stuff is like 2000 BC, maybe 3000 BC. It's probably much older. Well, you know, it's hard to say. This is an extinct type of bull that doesn't exist today. Some ancestor of the Brahma bull, which is, you know, common in India, of course, today, and also in the United States. When they got to the street levels of Mohenjo-Daro, people were just lying dead in the streets. Some doom had just taken over this city. Everyone was killed. No one buried the dead. They were lying in the streets, holding hands. And this is well known in archaeology, and it's a mystery. This doom, just like the ancient Indian epics had said, this doom took over, descended on these cities. Everyone was killed, and then the desert came in, buried these cities for thousands of years, and then, you know, in the early 1950s, late 1940s, they began excavating it, and they discovered this. The idea of all around in Arabia and India and places like that, you see places, this is also sort of like what we saw in Peru, and this is actually in Saudi Arabia, where just weird doors and carved things on these cliffs, but they were also part of, you know, some other, like, walls and things would have been attached to these or something. And today, we have no idea who built these things, why they were there, what happened to them. So all around India, I mean, this is also an area of sunken cities and things like that. Dwarka over here is also a sunken city. This is the city where Krishna is supposedly from. The story of the Ramayana is of really a prince named Rama. And he's the Rama of Hari Krishna. And he was this prince out right up here in the Ayodhya forest. He marries his sweetheart. Her name is Sita. And they're happily married for some years. But then she runs off with this other guy named Ravana. And he's supposedly the king in Sri Lanka down here. Rama's bummed out. His wife's left him. He goes and meditates in the forest for a while. And then finally, he kind of gets his gumption up and he says, you know, I'm going to go and get my wife back. So he gets into his flying machine, his Vimana. This is the story of the Ramayana. Flies down to Sri Lanka with the help of his buddy Hanuman, the monkey and stuff. I mean, he's in this flying machine. He has his battle with Ravana, lands his flying machine, tells his wayward wife to get in. Look, babe, you're coming home with me. He flies back up to Ayodhya, back up there, you know, this is his kingdom and stuff. And then, but of course, you know, his reputation and hers is totally ruined because she ran off with this other guy. And that causes problems for a while, but eventually they get back together and everything's cool. That's the story of the Ramayana. And everybody, every Hindu knows this, every Buddhist knows this story. It's very, very famous. And it's all about these flying machines. Now recently, too, with satellite photos, they've come with this, these satellites showing that from the very tip of India up here, that this is what they call Rama's Bridge. And this is underwater. But they think that this is a man-made causeway coming, and it's just barely underwater. But this is something like the highway going out to Key West or something. It's going along just a very kind of shallow part where they could build it up, and they built this, and this must have been many thousands of years ago. They've built this causeway that connects southern India to Sri Lanka, and here's one more picture of it. But this is underwater, so I mean, this satellite image is showing, you know, this thing. And so, right, this is apparently a man-made thing that was linking ancient India with Sri Lanka. Now, when you read the Ramayana, it's like reading some modern novel. And let's say, you know, the hero suddenly goes to the airport, gets in an airplane, flies to London, and all that. And, you know, when you're reading a novel, the author doesn't suddenly stop and tell you what an airplane is. You know, this is what an airplane is. He doesn't do that. And he knows that you know what an airplane is, so he doesn't have to explain it to you. And that's how the ancient Indian epics were, too. They would talk about these Vimanas and stuff, but they wouldn't really tell you what they were or describe them in any great detail and stuff. I mean, they were these airships. Well, then, in 1908, in the Royal Baroda Library in central India, they found this ancient manuscript, and it was all about Vimanas. It was all about these ancient airships. And at that time, Maharishi Bharadwaja, this was a 4th century BC manuscript. It said that it was a manuscript compiled from even older books. Ancient India, by the way, is kind of unique. And one of the things that's happened throughout history is there's been this purposeful destruction of knowledge and libraries. Like the Library of Alexandria, totally destroyed, all these books burned, hundreds of thousands of volumes, and a lot of it on the history of Egypt and stuff. We'll never know what to say. Emperor Qi Huangdi of China, who built a great wall on those terracotta warriors and stuff, he also ordered every book in China destroyed. When the Spanish conquered Central America and the Yucatan and stuff, they also collected all the Mayan Codex books and burned and destroyed them all. Only 4 Mayan codexes are known to exist today. India is a little bit different. India had not gone through this destruction of ancient libraries and things like that. So these ancient books in India still kind of exist, and people can read them to a point. And that's what the Vimanika Shastra was kind of about. So it was about yantras and all about machines. It was then translated out of Sanskrit by a guy named Josher in the 1950s. The book itself, it didn't have any illustrations. Illustrations were kind of made from the Vimanika Shastra, but it was really, I mean, because this was in the 1920s when they first started translating it. And so it was kind of the dawn of our own era of flight. And so trying to figure out what the Vimanika Shastra said about flight and stuff like that was different than what the early conceptions of flight were. And so there were 4 types of Vimanas that were described in the Vimanika Shastra. And that talks about the Rukma Vimana, which was a kind of a circular discoid craft like a flying saucer. Like this, and this is how they drew it. I mean, they put some propellers on it down here, but that's not really in the text. Here, they drew some electrical devices up here. The passenger's platform, it was this circular kind of discoid craft. That was the Rukma Vimana that was described in the Vimanika Shastra. There was the Tripura Vimana. It was more like a Zeppelin-type craft or cigar, tubular-type craft. And these are concepts from 1923. These guys in Bangalore trying to draw out what was being described in the Vimanika Shastra. There was the Shakuna Vimana. It was more like a winged craft, more like an airplane as we think of today with the wings and stuff like that. In the Vimanika Shastra, I mean, it talked about all kinds of aerial maneuvers, the metals and stuff that were in the craft. It talks about Mercury and that. So Mercury was part of, supposedly, these craft. And this is pretty interesting. Mercury comes from cinnabar. Cinnabar is a Sanskrit word, and cinnabar is like a mineral. And through heating cinnabar and stuff, you could extract mercury. And so even mercury itself, in a sense, from what we know, sort of comes from ancient India and the early extractions of it. Mercury in the West, Mercury was the messenger god. He flew through the air. He was a winged god, all that kind of stuff. That's the whole story of Mercury. So this Bill Clendenin, who I co-wrote this book called Vimana, Aircraft of Ancient India and Atlantis, he was really interested in the whole Vimanika Shastra and what it described. And what he decided was that the caduceus, which is also a symbol of Mercury, was what he called a kind of a Mercury vortex kind of a craft. He thought that the caduceus itself was a diagram for a kind of vortex, gyro type thing that was spinning about itself, and that it was symbol. The caduceus is also the symbol of the medical profession today, but it is associated with Mercury. This was Clendenin's kind of drawings of this craft. He felt that certain types of UFOs and stuff like that were actually these Mercury type of craft, what he called Mercury gyros. And the thing with Mercury, Mercury is a metal, it's a liquid, it's also a conductor. And this was a drawing by NASA engineer of Ezekiel. Ezekiel's a vision of this craft that comes down. It was wheels inside wheels. And they also drew it as some big propeller craft kind of thing. But Clendenin would have said, yeah, no, this is a gyro circulating craft that's using Mercury as in a gyro. What you can do is, in that sense, and I'm not going to get too technical here, but yeah, you can have, there's a type of a gyro that's a Mercury gyro, and it's a closed gyro, it's spinning, and Mercury's inside it, but then you electrify it. And by adding the electrical field to it, that's where you get what some people say is this anti-gravity effect. Oddball book was published in the late 80s in America. It's the first book really that talks about Mount Shasta as being some kind of a space base, a home of Atlanteans inside the mountains and stuff. And that was a book called A Dweller on Two Planets by Philos the Tibetan. Maybe you've heard of that book. It's still in print today. In that book is really it's a reincarnation story and karma story. It's about a guy and his different lives. He meets this master Kwong outside Mount Shasta. Kwong takes him into this door inside of Mount Shasta. Talks about some of their lives in Atlantis. At one point they go to Venus in this book. That's why he's a dweller on two planets, because he's been to Venus. And in that book they talk about the Obelisks, which is kind of was an Atlantean version of a Vimana. And there was illustration. That book did have illustrations in it. It had like 10, 15 drawings at the time from the text, and this is one of the drawings. And the Obelisks in that craft is a kind of a tubular, cigar-shaped airship with windows and stuff along the sides and lights. They use it to travel. These things are submarines too. Okay, in the books and stuff, the Atlantis. So they're tubular airships. They fly through the air. They go underwater, and they do all that in the book. Right around that time, 1896, was some strange things were happening across America and other parts of the world too, where people started seeing these airships in the sky. But it was before our time of flight. And although balloons and stuff like that had been invented at this time, but not airships like we think of Zeppelins and stuff like that. And it's interesting stories of starting in California and then going to Chicago, and these guys went across the Midwest. There's a lot of interesting stories on this. I won't dwell on it too much. But people were seeing these airships, sometimes these airships too had powerful electric lights and stuff like that in the front that were shining down. These were the stories, and these were in newspaper articles and stuff like that across the country, and even in New Zealand and other areas like that. So even today, it's a big mystery, and all certain UFO books and stuff like that will pick up on this. The idea here these kind of tubular craft like this, like the Vimanas were like this, and the Obelisks of Atlantis. This is a photo. It's the earliest known photo of a UFO. You've probably not seen this before. It was from like a stereo vision slide from 1871. It was a photo of from some mountains in New Hampshire, actually, and in it was apparently this kind of airship kind of craft that from before our time of flight. You have stories of kind of Captain Nemo kind of things. Jules Verne got into that, Robert the Great, these guys who are the secret inventors with their airships and stuff like that. And stories like that were coming out. All right, well, probably the greatest inventor who ever lived is Nikola Tesla. And he was born a Serbo-Croatian, 1856. He moved briefly to England, then he came to the United States. He worked for Edison for a while. And what Tesla did, he was an incredible genius. And and a very strange guy, too. In my mind, he was like a reincarnation of some Atlantean engineer, much like Cayce would talk about. He would envision his devices and things in the sky. He is the inventor of three-phase current that we use today. This building and the whole world is lit by his inventions, and that's AC electricity. And AC electricity is rotating magnetic fields. Every car has a small little generator. That's what makes electricity. An alternator, copper windings rotating around, electromagnet, and as it does that, it puts out three-phase current. He is the inventor of it. The world today is lit by this incredible genius. But he is like a suppressed person. And a lot of people, you go through history and you learn that Otis invented the elevator and, Edison invented the phonograph and stuff like that. But you don't really hear that much about Tesla because some of the things that he invented and did are still science fiction today, and we'll see why and how it relates to Edgar Cayce. Tesla had friends like Mark Twain. He briefly was very wealthy. He was very much a man of time. He was a very he was a poor businessman. He was very socially inept. He never got married. And he basically was the archetype for the mad scientist. And in fact, in the early Superman cartoons of the early 40s, the early Superman cartoons, Superman battles this mad scientist with all these weapons and death rays and stuff like that, and it's Tesla. And Tesla was actually passed away right around that time. Now, one of the things that Tesla did was and this was right around the turn of the century, he began developing a system of wireless power. All right, and he started demonstrating. He first went to Colorado Springs to develop what this transmission of power. And what it would do was, in the 1930s, his laboratory was burned down, destroyed. Many of his inventions were, he lost many of his inventions. But what Tesla wanted to do, and when he died in 1943, the first thing that happened was the FBI went into his apartment at the Waldorf Hotel in New York City, and they ransacked his apartment, took all his papers and things like that. Many of them are still secret today, the FBI files. We'll get back to Tesla in a minute and some of his inventions. Now, another person who was also a protege of Tesla and had worked with him early on was Guglielmo Marconi, who was oftentimes given credit for inventing the radio, although Tesla later fought a patent war with him, and he was awarded the patent. And in fact, Tesla is really the official inventor of the radio, not Marconi. Americans don't know Marconi that well. Marconi lived, he was an Italian, it was basically an Italian-British guy. Marconi Electronics in England and Europe, also in South America, still very major companies to this day. Marconi was a very kind of mysterious guy. And he died in 1937, and he wasn't very old. But Marconi, and I won't have time to go too much into him, some people think that he faked his death and actually went to South America. And that's also an oddball story. He, unlike Tesla, was a really good businessman. He could, he knew how to make money, make business deals, and stuff like that. All right, another figure here is Albert Einstein. Now, Einstein, around this time too, Einstein came up with what he called the unified field. And back in the 30s, this was a big deal, the unified field theory. And what the unified field theory was, the theory that gravity and electricity and magnetism all manifested from one force. And that force was the unified field. Okay? And so just like from the unified field, you would have an equation for electromagnetism, as they do, but with the unified field theory, you would have equations for electrogravity and magnetogravity. Okay? So the unified field, if it was could be actuated, was anti-gravity, gravity control. And that would be, I mean, that's like levitation technology and that kind of thing. So that was, but you didn't hear much about the unified field after Einstein's paper on it. Also during World War III, Einstein and Tesla was involved in this. They met with the US Navy. And Einstein also was part of this, a computer genius named John von Neumann. And what they allegedly all came up with, and this was all part of Tesla's ideas and Einstein's stuff, and that was what they called the Philadelphia experiment. Maybe you've heard of that. The Philadelphia experiment was an experiment to make battleships invisible and then also teleport them. And this is during World War II. Okay. And in fact, now, if you were, as a kid, I was a coin collector, and I collected pennies and stuff. And those of you who collected pennies in 1943, during the war, I think it was 43 or 44, there wasn't a copper penny. It was 43. Okay, it was a steel penny. And when you had your little penny book and you put your pennies from every year in, that 1943 penny was a steel penny and not a copper one. And that was always kind of unusual. Well, the Philadelphia experiment was actually one of the reasons for this, because they needed the copper to make copper cables, because what they were doing was they were winding the copper cables around the battleship, which is the USS Eldridge, just like you wind around a motor, okay, and then you throw a field into it, and that was the Philadelphia experiment, and then allegedly, the Eldridge then shifted out of this dimension and went invisible, and even teleported to Norfolk, right over here, allegedly. And then there's a lot of other weird stuff. There were sailors on board the ship. Some of them were fused to the hull when they turned off the field, supposedly. Others went crazy. Allegedly, some of the sailors on there, somehow their atoms and stuff were destabilized, and they would sort of fade out. They would tend to suddenly like go into another dimension or something like that. The Philadelphia experiment was really, let's go back. The Philadelphia experiment was sort of let out of the bag by this guy here, Morris K. Jessup. He was an astronomer from Indiana. This is the only known photo of him, taken from this Gray Barker Flying Saucer newsletter from the 50s. Strange thing happened to him. Now, he was the one who really wrote about the Philadelphia experiment and put it out in a book called Cayce for the Flying Saucers, and there was a thing called the Varro edition of this. He was one of the early victims, allegedly, of the Men in Black, and he was on his way to a UFO convention in Florida in 1959 when he suddenly pulled off the side of the road, wrote a suicide note, put a hose from his tailpipe into his car, and killed himself. And he's dead. Okay, and he never got to that UFO conference. So that's Morris K. Jessup. And he's the guy we wouldn't really know about the Philadelphia experiment. Now, this guy right here is a guy named Carl Allen, or Carlos Allende. This is his thing. He was a guy who claimed he was on the USS Eldridge. He claimed he was part of the Philadelphia experiment. He wrote these letters to Jessup. And he was still alive, really, until the early 1980s in Colorado. And he is dead today. But he is really the main source of like talking about the Philadelphia experiment. All right, now, so another thing that was happening in World War II around this time, this is very strange, was what they call Foo Fighters. Now, Foo Fighters were these balls of light that were starting to be seen over Germany towards the end of World War II. And they called them Foo Fighters from an old comic book character of the time named Smokey Stover. And in Smokey Stover, there was a line in there that would say, where there's foo, there's fire. And foo was a a pun on words of the French word for fire, feu. So when these balls of light, like this is a rare photo of Foo Fighters, as the Allied bombers were flying over Germany towards the end of the war, they would suddenly encounter these swarms of these glowing balls of light hovering around the bombers and stuff like that. And they were pulsing balls of light. These are photos. Here's another. This is like what they were like. Then the pilots and stuff would come back, and they started making these reports. And they got into the newspapers in Britain and America that the Germans had this new secret weapon. There were these balls of light. They were called, they nicknamed them Foo Fighters. And in many ways, it's the genesis of the early UFO activity that was then to begin right after World War II with the Roswell crash and stuff like that. What the Foo Fighters were actually, again, there's been reports of them. I mean, some UFO books will say, oh, well, these were aliens, right? But the Foo Fighters were like the size of a basketball or something like that. They weren't giant airships, but more just, like small balls. And there was pulsing light. But they were like this Mercury gyros, pulsing, spinning, bright balls of light. And what they did, actually, was the electrical field within the Foo Fighters, supposedly, would interfere with the electrical systems on the bombers. And what it was doing was, and it's a lot like UFO encounters today that you might have heard about, where the UFO hovers over your car, and the electrical system of your car goes dead, and your car won't start and stuff, because there's some interference with the electrical system. And that's what the Foo Fighters were doing. And apparently what the Germans' concept of the Foo Fighters was that it was going to interfere with the engines of the bombers so that bombers couldn't make it to Berlin and Dresden and drop all their bombs. And as the engines were cutting out, they would drop their bombs on just farms in Germany and not make it to their destinations and bomb the cities. That was apparently the idea of Foo Fighters. Towards the end of the World War II, the Germans actually began designing discoid craft. One of the things with World War II, elements of World War II was that it was an oil war. And the Axis powers, one of the things with them, they didn't have oil fields. The Germans didn't have oil fields, the Italians didn't have oil fields, and the Japanese didn't have oil fields either. There was something in common with those three nations. And what they did during the war was go and take oil fields. And the Germans occupied the oil fields in Eastern Europe and Ukraine and stuff. The Italians occupied oil fields in Libya and North Africa. The Japanese went and occupied oil fields in Manchuria. But what they did was, so with German technology and stuff like that, they, more than any other country, was where they were searching for alternative forms of power and flight and things that didn't require special gas mixtures and special aviation fuel. And the Germans, it seems incredible, but towards the end of the war, they actually began designing, at least, flying saucer craft. And these were electric things that were based on Tesla's ideas and Marconi. And in fact, the Germans had developed a flying wing kind of craft. And one of the earliest UFO incidences, which happened over the Cascade Mountains in Washington State, was when this businessman, Arnold, reported seeing what was this like boomerang type craft skipping over the Cascades. And he was a pilot himself. And this is where, in fact, the term flying saucer was invented at this time with this craft, because he said it was like skimming, it was like skipping through the air, he described it, like a saucer would skip. And what he was kind of meaning was like the way you would throw a stone on water and it would skim across. Well, the Germans, too, had developed exactly a craft like this. It was called the Horten H-18 in 1945. It was this boomerang winged craft and stuff like that. So a lot of what was, particularly in the 40s and early 50s, many of the things that people were seeing and describing were, we know now, At least, I mean, they were very similar to what the kind of craft that the Germans were beginning to develop at the end of the war, but they didn't have time to actually totally complete all these designs. And in fact, it's thought now too that the Germans had actually created an atom bomb towards the end of the war, but didn't get to use it. The Germans made a special flight in one of their super long-range bombers, and they had the longest-range bombers. They made a special practice flight from Germany to New York City and back, and it was to be, now they think, and British historians and stuff have confirmed this, that they think this was a practice bombing run for an atomic bombing run on New York City by the Germans. It's also thought that those atomic bombs were captured by the United States at the end of the war, and it's even thought by some people, including British historians, that one of the bombs that was dropped on Japan was actually a German atom bomb. Okay, so the idea too that the Germans were starting to develop these craft, discoid craft, they too were analogous to Vimanas and circular discoid craft. Mercury was part of it. A strange thing started happening with the subs. After the end of World War II, a number of submarines didn't surrender immediately after the war, and some German subs didn't surrender till months and months after the war. And one of these subs was actually torpedoed near Singapore, and it was apparently on its way to Japan. The cargo of that submarine was Mercury. And historians, even today, I mean, they know that some of these subs had this Mercury cargo, but they don't know why. And they have no idea why the Germans would be trying to transport giant subs full of Mercury, trying to go, like, say, to Japan and Argentina and other areas like that. The Germans, too, allegedly, from the plans and stuff, and they've tried to keep this secret all these years, even plans and stuff like that for what they call the Andromeda craft. It also was a cigar-shaped craft, kind of your mothership. They had different names for these craft, the Honeyboo, the Vril. This is supposedly a photo of an Andromeda craft, and these are kind of German things. This is a Vril craft like that. There are photos. There's a number of books out now, including a number of British ones. If you go to Poland, which, you know, of course was occupied, and Peenemünde, which was the German space base during World War II, was, you know, it's right there on the border of Poland. In Poland, they're really big on all this stuff, and there's a number of books all about it. In 1949, as Werner von Braun became a captured scientist. They used what they call Project Paperclip. They began bringing all these Germans to the United States. They could not take German scientists and stuff to Britain because of the war. I mean, the opinion of people in Britain was there was no way they were going to let a bunch of Nazis come and work in Britain. But in the United States it was different. They brought thousands of Nazi scientists and stuff to the United States and made them part of the space program and stuff, which everybody knows. During 1949 and 1950, particularly around Los Angeles, there were waves of flying saucers, daylight sightings, fleets of flying saucers, flying in formation. Los Angeles newspapers almost daily in 1950 had stories and newspaper stories about flying saucers. This was when the whole flying saucer mania began appearing. The famous columnists, you know, they would start talking about flying saucers. I mean, people were seeing them. I mean, and right in the middle of the day, particularly around Southern California. Even stories too and then people, you know, talked about, well, hey, the Martians are here and the little green men, but other people said, no, flying saucers, you know, you know, they were invented 23 years ago and stuff like that. So now you suddenly have the arguments of the man-made craft versus, well, they've got to be from outer space kind of thing, and this continues today. So, so you're going to go, you know, and that was one way to debunk these things. Okay, well, who's going to fly a flying saucer? Well, it must be a little green man, that kind of a thing. So even today in ufology, I mean, this still rages. Could they be building flying saucers at Area 51? Oh, no, well, they have to capture aliens to do that. get alien technology, that kind of a thing. In 1949, Professor Clyde Tombaugh, and he is the astronomer who discovered Pluto. Okay, so he's a famous astronomer. They've now downgraded Pluto's not a planet anymore, but he's the guy who discovered it. Well, he lived in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and it's a very, very famous sighting where because he would sit out all night in Las Cruces, New Mexico, looking at the stars. That's what he was, an astronomer, and he witnessed this cigar-shaped craft, very much like a Vimana or a Obelisks or these other craft, these cigar-shaped tubular craft with the windows. The Germans, too, allegedly came up with their design for a craft like this. And these things don't have wings or anything, too. I mean, they're using some kind of anti-gravity. I mean, and when Clyde Tombaugh says, yeah, he saw this craft with these, the lights along the side, I mean, he's a very, very credible witness. He didn't have a photograph of it, so just made a drawing. So the idea, too, I mean, from the Project Blue Book files, they actually had photos of here. This was supposedly a French flying disc. And these photos, I mean, they're daylight photos of this craft, and they look like they're old 40s craft. I mean, if what do flying saucers in the 40s look like? Well, like cars from the 40s. They look like 40s craft, I mean, they don't look like they're 90s craft in the 40s. They look like they're from that era. Today, flying saucers and stuff, they look like they're 90s flying saucers, Hey. And it's and you're going to have a flying saucer, you want the latest nice design, that's sleek and all that. Nice color. Stuff like that. Well, I mean, and stuff like this. I mean, the Blue Book sat on these files and stuff like that, and I mean, and they were classified for years. And it would be 20, 30 years before the Air Force would even declassify it and say, yeah, well, we don't need these photos of these French flying saucers anymore. This was another French guy who had a flying saucer in 1955. And this got into newspapers and stuff like that. Whoops, sorry. Yeah, this guy, I mean, this was actually appeared in newspapers and stuff like that. He had his flying saucer. It was like apparently jet propelled and stuff like that. He was going to fly it around, develop it, sell it to people and stuff. But then suddenly he died in a car crash, that year. And everything was dismantled and sold, and nobody ever heard of his company or anything again. You'll probably never hear or see about this in some UFO documentary on TV, although in New Zealand it's very famous. The idea now of these craft from Tesla times and Marconi and the Germans, I mean, it's actual normal physics, but it has to do with plasmas and Mercury. A plasma is an electrified gas, like a neon light, something like that. You have a plasma in this case is a gas that's electrified, and that works with Mercury. And so when you have Mercury spinning around and then you electrify it, and you create a plasma, an electrified gas. And if it's in a gyroscopic type formation, then it's going to, I mean, the whole thing's spinning. One of the side products of a plasma is bright lights, like a neon light. So the common concept of these lights spinning around a flying saucer, and it's rotating, they're bright, and bright lights are part of it. That's part of a plasma, and it can't be stopped. It's a side effect that you can't do anything about. So if you're going to have a flying saucer that's a plasma craft, that's going to be part of it, these bright lights and stuff like that. And that is a common thing with flying saucers. This is from a British guy's book called Gravitational Manipulation of Domed Craft by a British engineer named Paul Potter. And these were some of his illustrations of how a plasma craft works, pulsing, manipulating the gas. It's all spinning in a toroid. That was interesting, too, yesterday with Freddie De Silva's toroid visions of some of those crop circles, because that's part of it, too. And a toroid is a donut shape spinning on itself. In fact, study anti-gravity and gravity effects, they use smoke rings as part of the physics. And if you've ever seen someone smoke a cigar and blow a smoke ring out, that's also kind of like a plasma toroid. And it's spinning in on itself like a donut as it moves through the air, all right? And that's part of what's called plasma technology. So right now, I mean, this is what apparently the Germans were doing. America, in my mind, was able to use these and take some of this captured German technology. They brought it first, actually, to New Mexico. That's where most of the captured German scientists worked. Then later, they moved it all to Nevada and to Area 51. During also that time, and starting in the 40s and 50s, there was a couple of other American scientists who were relatively well known. A guy named T. Townsend Brown and a guy named Agnew Bonson. They worked for the government, and they were doing these anti-gravity discoid experiments. This guy over here is allegedly one of the early photos of a man in black standing in their lab watching them make these toroid tests, these antennas, and it has to do with and it's all electric. I mean, that's part of the thing with these craft. They are electric. They're not powered by rocket fuel or anything like that. They have electric field. It's all back to Einstein's unified field of electromagnetism, electrogravity, magnetogravity, and the unified field and stuff like that. The toroidal coil test and stuff like that is actually film about this. T. Townsend Brown, for a while, he was a guy in the newspapers in the 50s doing these tests and stuff like that, and then suddenly you didn't hear about him anymore. And there was a point really around 1960 where anything that had to do with experiments like this was totally shut down, and you just didn't hear about it in any newspapers. And the government, of course, would never admit to anything like this. But I mean, this is the, what we call UFO technology. All right, let's see, how are we doing here? All right, we're going to go briefly to the moon. I hope we have time, and we'll get back so we can get back to our hotels. So the whole kind of thing, too, of going to the moon, what's going on in the moon. Just yesterday, NASA crashed this rocket into the moon. They're trying to find water there. I did a book some years ago called Extraterrestrial Archaeology, which was all about structures and unusual things on the moon. And that's a lot of these slides you're about to see in a couple of minutes are from that. There were certain craters on the moon that had what they call translunar light phenomenon. And they would see lights on the moon, astronomers, and particularly this one crater called Gassendi, they were seeing lights along that crater. And this was famous with early astronomers. A lot of early astronomers, as they looked at the moon, they would like think they saw cities. This became famous. Unusual structures on the moon. This was all through telescopes and things like that. They would draw pictures of their lunar cities and things like that, and there was something going on the moon. There were structures, all this kind of stuff. Some of the rays and stuff coming out from some of the mares and things like that. And there's these trails on the moon. I get into all this in the book. There's still a mystery exactly. Geologists and NASA really can't explain why these weird trails on the moon. And you kind of see up here how the idea that they would be ejecta from craters and stuff like that. I don't know. Certain other areas of the moon were thought to have special geometric shapes, like this Madler's square and stuff like that. And so the idea too would be that when the Apollo missions and stuff like that went to the moon, well, NASA wouldn't admit it, but they probably wanted to go and check out some of these oddball craters on the moon where lights had been seen, other areas of the moon that seemed to show oddball geometric things and stuff like that. One of the oddball things, too, they found out with the moon, with NASA, that they claimed later as they dropped stages of the command modules from Apollo and stuff onto the moon, that the moon rang and vibrated like a bell. And that and this led to some people speculating that the moon was hollow. And that the moon literally, in that concept, is a hollow artificial satellite put into a special orbit around our planet. And almost like, and in fact, George Lucas then took that idea as the Death Star kind of thing in the Star Wars thing, where you put a giant artificial planet that's occupied and everything, and you haul it and put into orbit around somebody's planet, and you can use it to control them. And this was the idea that some people had, that the moon was like that. And there was something. And in fact, NASA went on to say that the moon is older than the Earth. And the idea that the moon was like just a twin companion to the Earth and was pulled out, and NASA later, in the early 70s said, no, the moon is older than the Earth, and it's not, what it's made up and everything is not the same as Earth. They're starting to reverse that now, and of course now they want to find water on the moon and all that. That's fine. The idea too of these areas of the moon with oddball, giant like weird spires and stuff like that. Richard Hoagland at one point also released a photograph of what appeared this giant tower on the moon. Oddball structures. Certain craters on the moon seem to have domes and stuff like that in the middle of the craters. Other craters here, like this Longinus crater, had also what appeared to be, here, kind of domes that were lit up by late afternoon sun coming on them. The idea of dome cities and things. This crater up here called Aristelis was unusual too, because what it seemed to have in the middle of it was a big series of pyramids right there. I mean, there were oddball things in some of these craters, and they began noticing, but it wasn't. But NASA itself wouldn't really talk too much about it. But in the 70s, a couple of oddball books came out. One was by this guy named Don Wilson called Secrets of Our Spaceship Moon. He maintained, yes, on the moon there were pyramids and other geometric forms and stuff like that. Another guy in the 70s named George Leonard, he wrote a book called Somebody Else is on the Moon. He also maintained that craters were being mined on the moon, that there were structures and things on the moon. NASA knew all about it, was covering it up. One of the things about the moon is really rich in rare metals, titanium and things like that, and a lot of metals used for aerospace and whatnot. And in fact, if you were mining the moon, you're mining, some of the rarest elements and metals and stuff like that. I mean, stuff that's very, very difficult to find on the Earth. Leonard, too, he believed that there were parts of the moon where that they had built big bridges, there were big chasms. He believed that there were these things called X-drones that moved around on the moon. They were like mining machines. They scooped up lunar soil and stuff, processed it, ejected it out the back in these sprays. I mean, some of the things he was saying that was going on the moon, and there were photographs and stuff like that. I mean, it was mind-blowing. And when you combine that with some of the oddball stuff that NASA, Apollo scientists and stuff said, I mean, it was all, speculation a lot for really some strange things. There were also things like these unusual craters and bottomless craters. NASA even did a whole study on these things that are moving around on the moon, okay, and these leaving tracks behind them, like some rolling object leaving a track. George Lucas in the Star Wars movies also picked up on that, on these desert planets and stuff like this. NASA's explanation for this, too, is that it's a rock rolling around on the moon. That's what they say. Here's another one. And in fact, even on one of the Apollo missions, that was one of the things the Apollo astronauts tried to do, was take pictures of these. Yeah. Did you know that? Rocks roll around on the moon. One of the rocks rolled up out of a crater and then down the other side, supposedly. Go figure. I mean, they did unusual studies. I mean, they're just, I'm always so thrilled when I find out that the Chinese and the Indians and Americans, are going back to the moon. Let's go back. Let's find water on the moon. Let's put some base up there. Just oddball little things, these rivulets and things like that they're looking for water on the moon, and yet, but yeah, it even looks like there's dried up, creeks and things like that. So they did a lot of different studies like this. Even the Apollo astronauts were given this packet as they went around the moon. They were supposed to look for certain things and just objects and stuff like that, and then report back. Some of the craters, particularly towards the South Pole, this is where they're trying to find water and crashing in. I mean, they're very oddball craters with like flat, like perfectly flat lava beds and things like that. I mean, there's a number of books I could really go, I mean, you just have to sort of pore over all these different photos and things like that to check it out. I mean, I find it pretty interesting. Now, the idea, too, that if we were to go to the moon and to Mars and occupy it or something like that, we would go underground. And, yeah, the facilities and things like that they would build on the moon would not be on the surface. You would have to land and then we'd go down under the moon. And, in fact, I was watching the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey just some months ago, and that's what happens in that movie too. As they go to the moon, there's this big object on the moon, the movie's all about, but they also all go underground. And most of the stuff that's happening in that movie when it's on the moon, it's all in this underground base on the moon. This was also a thing that Leonard talked about over here, which was this crater. They can't find a bottom to it, and it almost appears to have a structure up here. Leonard was big on this, George Leonard, and somebody else is on the moon. And he believed also that the moon was hollow, you could somehow get inside the moon, and that certain craters like this one were like entrances into the moon. And this is what Leonard drew of that crater. He felt there was this giant object going down. They couldn't find a bottom to it. Now we'll get back to Tesla. Now we're going to get back to Cayce, and then we'll wind up. What is also on the moon is a thing called the Blair cuspids. And we'll go back to Tesla briefly here. So Tesla also in the 30s had this, he died in 43, but they started talking about death rays and things like that. And these were these powerful tractor beams, death rays. They could do all kinds of unusual things. Death rays, sometimes talk about what they call scalar waves. It's two kinds of waves or beams coming down, and then they meet, and they create these powerful lights. They're also death rays. They can disintegrate things. This is stuff from the 30s again, okay? Seems like science fiction today. But what Tesla's real pet project was what he called the wireless transmission of power. And Tesla, starting around 1918, his company, what it was going to do was build these towers, okay, and these transmitters. And he first built the prototypes in Colorado Springs. Then he began building his first tower at Long Island, okay, and it was to be this tower. And what it would do was transmit power through the atmosphere. He had patents for it and everything. Here's the concept. It's like a radio station broadcast radio, like a television, broadcast television. Tesla wanted to broadcast electricity. He wanted to broadcast what he called longitudinal waves. And what that meant, which is incredible, is that right now, if you have an electrical device or something, you've got to plug it into the wall, and it's got to be part of the electrical grid that's all, stretching around the country, coming from power plants, being brought to your city and right to your house, right to this building by power lines. And then those power lines go to outlets and things like that, and then you can plug something into that outlet, and you've got electricity. You plug your lamp in or whatever. Tesla's idea was different than that. You would be able to put a lamp on a table and turn it on. You wouldn't have to plug it into a wall, okay? It was essentially like free energy. Now, but it still had to have a power station behind it. There still had to be a Niagara Falls. It still had to be generating power. But it was a kind of, it was like radio or TV, but it was energy being broadcast, okay? Now, let's look at this Cayce readings. In Poseidia, the entity dwelt among those that had charge of the storage of the motivative forces from the great crystals that so condensed the lights, the forms of the activities, as to guide the ships in the sea and in the air, and inconveniences of the body as television and recording voice. I mean, it's just a bit of an obtuse reading, but this is one of Cayce's readings about the terrible crystal, the engineers from Atlantis and their past lives that he occasionally talked about. And this one specifically is saying that, yes, it's like television. It's like radio. And what that was. And of course, during Cayce's time, I mean, Cayce would know who Nikola Tesla was, and I would say he probably had heard of Tesla's wireless transmission of power. But what Cayce is saying here, in my mind, is exactly the same as Tesla's wireless power, broadcasting power, and it would guide ships and these airships and stuff. Now, in the 1920s, as Tesla was developing all this, but later the FBI stopped him, his tower was torn down, but the magazines at the time ran a bunch of articles of what Tesla was envisioning. And what it was were these airships that were totally electric, without wings or anything. They were anti-gravity, and they were powered by his towers. Okay, and this is also a drawing that appeared in like Electrical Experimenter in 1923 or something, and it's got Tesla's power towers are fully functioning. They're broadcasting this power out into the atmosphere. These airships and like airplanes with these bright searchlights and stuff, other cigar-shaped craft are picking up power from these power towers, and they're flying. I mean, this is still science fiction today. Although what's starting to happen because of computers, just recently, computer magazines this whole thing of wireless power is coming back in just in the last year or so. And it's all because of laptop computers. And now you can take your little AT&T thing and plug it into the USB port on your computer. But now they want your computer to be powered that way too. And this is all now coming out of Palo Alto and Apple computers and Microsoft and stuff. Where, yeah, you're going to take your laptop and, you know, you'll be in like a hotspot or something, but you won't need a battery or to have to plug it in and charge it. You'll just set it there at the airport and it will power up, just sitting wherever you are. And that is exactly what Tesla was trying to do, and I think that was what Cayce was talking about too. Here again is another one of Tesla's kind of unusual towers and stuff like that. It's broadcasting power. Here are these airships. They're drawing power from his towers. They're having aerial battles. He also said, oh yeah, we'll need this in warfare and stuff like this. Well, what happened instead was World War II came along, Tesla died, and and nobody ever heard about this again, basically. All right, now back to a group out of California called the Lemurian Fellowship. They came out of the 1930s, out of Milwaukee and Chicago, and then moved to California. They published a book called An Earth Dweller Returns, which was also by Philos the Tibetan. In that book, they talked about what's called the Maxed Tower of Atlantis. And it basically was the same as a Tesla tower. Only what it was a giant crystal tower like what Tesla was building, and it too broadcast power, but this was 10,000, 20,000 years ago in Atlantean times. So what are these crystal towers? Well, and the Great Crystal, I mean, there are things exactly like them still here today, and they're called obelisks. And obelisks are monolithic granite, and you want a true obelisk needs to be monolithic. I mean, it's one single stone. It needs to be cut like a tuning fork. I mean, it's a certain size and design. I mean, a giant tower of crystal, and it needs to be granite to be a crystal, because the crystals are embedded in it. So you have, and there's a whole mystery of obelisks themselves, in that obelisks, later they had the hieroglyphs and stuff on it. Even just standing an obelisk up is baffling to Egyptologists. They can't figure out how they did it. Very few books have ever been written on obelisks. Obelisks themselves are they're one of the major enigmas in Egypt. What are they for? Again, we were talking earlier today, why would the ancients want to build with giant blocks of stone the size of railway cars and things like that? I mean, it seems like everything they're doing is just incredibly difficult. It's something we wouldn't even try and do today. And obelisks are the same. To quarry an obelisk, to erect an obelisk, and even what the purpose of an obelisk. Egyptologists, again, they have to explain what the purpose of an obelisk is. Do you know? Here's what Egyptologists say an obelisk is for. It's a representation of a ray of the sun. Okay? So like the Atenist, if you've seen like that, where the rays of the sun are coming down, they have little hands, and they're touching Akhenaten or Nefertiti and stuff like that. You know, it's this Ra or Aten coming down. And that's what an obelisk is too. It's this giant 200-ton granite monolith, and it's all just to represent a ray of the sun. But how, I mean, to stand an obelisk up, there's a show on Nova, and Mark Lerner is part of it, where they take a very small obelisk and they're trying to erect it. They can't do it. And later they finally come to Massachusetts, where they have this kind of idea of like doing a sand pit and leaning it in, and then they take the sand out, and eventually this small obelisk can stand up. The Washington Monument. I mean, when you watch CNN and stuff like that, they're often going to have the Washington Monument behind it. This is a rare photo of lightning hitting the Washington Monument. The Washington Monument is not a true obelisk, by the way, because it's not a monolith. All right, it's basically an imitation of an obelisk. But it's interesting that, yeah, the Masons and the Founding Fathers, for whatever reason, and even today, I mean, I'm fascinated by obelisks, and I kind of, like the Olmecs, I mean, there's only, that I know of, 4 or 5 books ever written about obelisks, because they can't explain them or know what they're for or what. I mean, they're baffling. And so, but yeah, for some reason, obelisks today are, yeah, they're like the symbol of America, in a sense, and of ancient power. So the idea, what I'm trying to say here at the end, is that obelisks, at one time, obelisks were all over the world. And I believe that the obelisks are the terrible crystal and the power towers that Cayce was talking about, and they're analogous to Tesla's wireless power system. And this is what Tesla was trying to do, was what had been created in Poseid and Atlantis, and Cayce's readings, I believe, support this. This is the unfinished obelisk at the quarry in Aswan. This too, I mean, this is one of the largest, quarried stones in the world, but it was never finished because they discovered as they were quarrying it that it had a crack, which was in the bedrock, and they didn't know it until they had almost finished quarrying it. But as soon as they discovered that the unfinished obelisk, as they call it, wasn't totally perfect, and to be a power tower, it has to be perfect. It can't have any flaws in it. But once they discovered that, they abandoned the manufacturing. They just left it. And today, it's a major tourist site to see when you're in Aswan. And like I'm saying, obelisks were around the world. At Tiwanaku, there was supposedly an obelisk also there in Bolivia. This is an obelisk, too, that's in Morocco, near Tangiers. I was very interested when Freire de Silva showed that obelisk in Portugal. I asked him later, I said, wow, I want to go to that obelisk. And what happens to with these obelisks is that because they're thousands and thousands of years old and they're still standing up, they have to be buried quite a bit in the ground to keep them standing up. They become eroded. People go up there and chip and pound away at them, but they're virtually indestructible, but they can be kind of eroded with constant pounding. And Freddie told me, he said that there are obelisks all over Portugal. And I found that interesting. In England, too, there are the remains of obelisks, and they're called the Devil's Arrows in Yorkshire. Obelisks also, the only other place where obelisks really exist today, like in Egypt, is Ethiopia. And near Aksum, there's a couple of obelisks like this, and they were recarved. And that's what the Egyptians did, because they were already there. In fact, Karnak Temple, I believe, was built around these obelisks. Now, these obelisks would have to have power stations built with them, okay? I mean, just like power stations today, which would have to run on hydroelectric or something to turn the three-phase motors. But then the power, and this was Tesla's idea, and the power would go to the towers, like an obelisk, and that would be broadcast through these crystal antennas. We're almost done here, and what happened here, this was unusual, and I found this book. This was written by a Canadian named Hugh Cochrane. In the 1970s, when the Bermuda Triangle was so popular, and people were writing all these Devil's Triangles and Bermuda Triangle books, then a bunch of books came out about the Great Lakes Triangles. And how, yeah, there's a Devil's Triangle in the Great Lakes too. And this was one of them. And it was really only published in England. It was called Gateway to Oblivion. All right, now one of the chapters in this book was really interesting, because what he was saying was a really unusual story. And that is in Lake Ontario, on the Canadian side, right up in here, what's called Presqu'île Provincial Park, right up in here. And what Hugh Cochrane was saying in this one chapter of his book was that in the early 1800s, like 1805, Canadians would go out on a Sunday on a rowboat, and they would row out just a little bit into the lake right around in here, and what was there was an obelisk coming up from the lake. And the tip of this obelisk was just barely making it above the water. And people would row their rowboats out there, and they would anchor on the tip of this obelisk. This is what he said. And this was your Sunday picnic for these people who lived right around this Presqu'île Provincial Park. What happened there, though, was that there was a really, really terrific storm in 1805 on the lake, and it sunk all these ships and stuff. It was big deal, and actually an Indian chief had made some prophecy about it and stuff like that, some kind of a curse or something. But after that storm, the obelisk was gone, and it had somehow fallen, and it's not there today. So I thought that was really strange, because I was really trying to find out, because I really became fascinating with Tesla and obelisks and Cayce's readings and stuff like that. Now, back to the moon. In the 1960s, a British astronomer, his name was Blair, and he was going through some of the Soviet probe photos of the moon from what they called the Zond probes, and he found these things, and he called them the Blair cuspids, okay? And they're right here, and they have shadows. It's a little hard to see. It's from an old Soviet photo. The Soviets themselves got really into this, and this is what they call the Blair cuspids. And here's the photo, and from the shadows, what the Blair cuspids are on the moon is an obelisk. And, I mean, how is that mind-blowing? So, from what I can tell, I mean, obelisks aren't just in Egypt or Ethiopia. In ancient times, this is what I'm saying. That it's the conclusion I've come to. You can come to your own. That, yeah, the entire world at 15,000 BC was surrounded by this Atlantean power system. It involved obelisks. Obelisks were all over the world then, and even, incredibly, on the moon. I mean, that's mind-blowing. So the whole idea of the moon being, something that's just a little bit weird, to say the least, has a lot to do with the eclipses on the moon, the way the Earth eclipses. This is stories, too, from the Ramayana and ancient Hindus that ancient people also went to the moon. And just, I mean, you know, there's nothing new under the sun, as King Solomon said. And what is the technology we have today, and even the technology to go to the moon? I mean, in 150 years, you know, we've gone from having, you know, primitive steam engines to going to the moon in 150 years of our culture. And I mean, that's a pretty good technological progression there. But in the thousands and thousands of years of history and civilization, there's no reason why the Atlanteans, the people up the side, whatever, Cayce more or less talked about this, that yeah, they went to the moon too. I mean, if the Americans can go to the moon, in my mind, the Atlanteans can do it too. And that is the end of my program. So thank you.